Harry, a name out of the past. I'm going to give you his name, and I want you to tell me the integral role he played in your life. Frank Summers.
Oh, boy. You know, you go back and talk. I don't care whether it's Jim Brown. I don't care who it is. There's always that person that becomes not just a mentor, but a sponsor and a role model. And for me, Frank Summers was that guy. He was the first black assistant state attorney general in Illinois. He was the biggest lawyer in East St. Louis. He had gone to the university, graduated from the University of Indiana. He played tennis at the University of Indiana at a time when he could not even be in the locker room with his white teammates. And so he understood the nature of the times and that things were changing. And so he always took time out. My father had met him through the Paramount Democratic Club. And he took a liking to my father. My father introduced me to him, and he immediately said, "Hey, why don't we spend some time together?" And he would he would have me come up and cut his lawn, and he'd come out, and I'd maybe push the lawnmower a couple of times. And he said, "Well, it looked like you've been working pretty hard. Why don't you come on in? Let's sit down and have lunch." And we'd sit down and have lunch, and he'd tell me all of these stories about the University of Indiana and about Paul Robeson. He would tell me all of these stories about athletes and so forth and so on. He became a phenomenal influence in my life. He was particularly interested in me, I think, because there was a space that he was trying to fill. He had a son. He always wanted his son to be an athlete, but the kid just didn't have that kind of a disposition. Mm-hmm. He played tennis, he ran a little track, he did some other things. He sent him to the University of California at Berkeley. Mm-hmm. And his son, during his sophomore year, in the fall of his sophomore year, died in a dormitory at the University of California at Berkeley. They found him dead in the dorm. And I think that there was some sense that if we had kept him closer to home, if we hadn't tried to push him on the athletic thing, because as it turned out, the kid had a bad heart problem. And I think that there was a space in his mind and in Mr. Summers' mind and in his heart that was filled by bringing me up and talk. Even though most of the time, I was there for the lunch and to be able to hang out and one thing or another, because he had a beautiful home, very very nicely furnished and outfitted, and I loved going in there because it was in direct contrast to the 3-room place that we had that had 10 people in it, But he was a fascinating man. He had also sponsored other athletes. He was among a group of athletes that brought Arthur Ashe to St. Louis to play in a number of tennis tournaments and participate in some tennis camps. So he had a phenomenal influence on me, but more than anything having to do with athletics, this broader world view that he had. He thought in terms of what you could do as far as being somebody in this country, not just in East St. Louis, not even just in the state. You have an opportunity to have an influence on the way things are evolving in this nation, in the world. He used to tell me about Ralph Bunche. Mm-hmm. He used to tell me about A. Philip Randolph. He'd tell me about all of these great people from the past. And so he had a phenomenal influence on me. And in the end, when I was traveling around to schools as a prospective football player, University of Iowa, University of Indiana, University of Illinois, Drake, University of Missouri, I never got an offer from them. But he said, you know what, you need to get out of the Midwest, you need to get out of East St. Louis. You don't need to be someplace where you can come home to East St. Louis for Thanksgiving and for Christmas. And he said there's a school on the West Coast. I said University of California. He said no. He said University of Southern California. He said they're a great track school. He said, and on top of it, they have at their school, their quarterback is black, and he's also the captain of the football team. And this was in 1958. Mm-hmm. And he said, and the coach out there named a Jewish kid as co-captain of the football team. He said, that's where you want to go. And so I said, well, he said University of Southern California. And the coach at that time, and I think probably one of the moving force behind this thing was Al Davis. Mm-hmm. was on the coaching staff at that time. Yeah, mm-hmm. And so that's how I wound up coming out to California. But of course, once I got out here, the first thing the people at SC said is, well, what are your college, you got to give us your college admission scores and records. There was something called the college admissions test.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Uh-huh.
Which they said, well, I said, I didn't take a college admissions test. They said, well, you got to take the college admissions test. And so they're scheduled all over the state at a particular time. You can go in and take them. I went into, I was in Fresno because my grandmother lived down there. And I went in to take the college admissions test. Hey, you know what? The first section was on math. I couldn't even read the thing. I mean, I had no idea what they were talking about. I just got up and walked out. Mm-hmm. And so when I got back in touch with it, they said, well, did you take the, I said, no, I couldn't pass it, you know. They said, well, you go to junior college for a year. You don't have to take the college admissions. You can do a straight transfer, but you've got to have 2.75 or something like that average. And that's how I ended up at Fresno City College, which was a feeder school for SC, along with Bakersfield City mm-hmm. College, LA City. Mm-hmm. These were all feeder schools.
Santa Monica,
Santa Monica for SC. So that's how I ended up in Fresno. But the person behind all of that, when I had to go to junior college, was Frank Summers. He gave me $500. He said, take this. This will help pay your living expenses. This will help defray whatever cost you may incur out there living with your grandmother, what have you. But you've got to be a great student. You've got to be a great athlete. And so this is how the Fresno mm-hmm. section opened up.
So it's 1960 and Harry Edwards makes the transition from East St. Louis, Illinois to Fresno City.
Yes.
To junior college, community college, as we would probably call it today. What was it like? That's a harsh transition, geographic
culture
transition
shock
from East St. Louis to Fresno.
Culture shock. First of all, I had never been anywhere mm-hmm. that was that hot. I got there in February because I graduated in January. I got there in February, so it was fairly nice right through May. Mm-hmm. And participating in sports and really bearing down on the books because that was the hardest transition. You know, you've got to get this done or your next stop is right back to East St. Louis, and I couldn't do that. So I really had to double down on the books. I remember sitting in the library trying to read stuff and trying to wrap my mind around stuff, and literally breaking down, crying because I could not remember what I read on the last page and how it fit together. But it's like anything else. You work hard enough, you keep grinding away at it, your mind will take over and begin to put it together. It's like I remember reading about Bird, Charlie Parker, and he'd been hearing something in his head for years that he that he couldn't play. And he just kept playing, kept playing, kept playing, kept playing. Finally, he just put it down out of sheer frustration, put the horn down, went and took a job up in the Adirondacks or someplace washing dishes at a resort lodge. And then after washing dishes one night, being up about 11, 12 o'clock, he's tired. He went back to his room and just picked up his horn and started blowing, and it just came out. His mind had put it together. And it's the same thing that happens when you're really, really pushing to learn how to learn, and reading is a tremendous path to that. But I knew that I had to get that done. I knew that I had to get the athletic piece done. Otherwise, SC would no longer be interested in me. And so this is what drove me in the basketball. This is what drove me in the track and field. This is what drove me in the training and running and so forth, getting ready really to play football at SC that fall. But SC told me you have to have a whole year. That meant that I would have had to stay there through that summer and into the fall and so forth. And that summer, I remember the temperature hitting 119 degrees on the sidewalk outside of my grandmama's house. And I'd never been in heat like that before in my life. And when I began to talk to some of my other relatives down there about it, they said, "Oh, this don't get hot." Say, you got to go to, they talked about someplace, Coalinga, you got to go to Taft, you got to go there. That's where it gets hot. I said, man, I can't deal with this. I mean, it was stifling hot. And that's when I went back to the shoebox, and I had a scholarship offer from San Jose State. And I didn't have to leave California. It was cooler up north, and that's how I ended up at San Jose State rather than sticking around for another semester to go to USC.
All right, when you're at Fresno City, you decided you're going to try out for track and field, and you're going to throw the discus, and your coach was Coach Ginsburg.
Right.
Tell us about the first time he ever saw you throw the discus.
Well, he when I walked out, because they didn't know I was coming. And but I knew that if I'm gonna be here, they have athletic team. We'll play athletics because that's what I do, And so I went out to the track out on Blackstone, Fresno, the Fresno track where they held the West Coast relays and everything else. And so I went out there, and he looked at me. Coach Ginsburg was on the field. He looked at me and he said, "Oh man, with those legs, you should be a heck of a quarter of a mile." I said, "No, I'm a discus thrower." he said, "Discus, because there were black discus throwers, I mean, you were talking Al Orta and Rink Babka and Jay Sylvester and so, but black discus thrower, you got to be kidding me." I said, "No, I'm a discus thrower." He said, "Run the quarter." I said, "I'm not a quarter runner. I don't run. I'm a discus thrower." He said, "How old are you?" I said, "I'm 17 years old." "And you're a discus thrower?" "Yeah." He said, "You ever thrown a college discus?" I said, "No, I threw the discus in high school." He said, "Well, how far?" I said, "Well, I was an all-state discus thrower. We came in first, second, and third in the discus in Illinois. We swept the discus in Illinois. And you're a discus thrower?" I said, "Yeah, I'm a discus thrower." So he said, "Okay, well, throw the discus." So I got in the ring, and he said, "What kind of spin do you use?" I said, "I don't use any spin." He said, "What do you mean you don't use any spin?" I said, "They didn't teach us to spin." He said, we just threw the discus." And so he said, "Okay, well, this is the college discus. It's about 1.5 pounds heavier and 2 pounds heavier, and you need to, it's going to take some getting used to." So I just stood in the ring, threw the discus, and he looked, and then he looked at me, and then he walked out to where it hit. He picked it up and brought it back. He said, "You know what?" I said, "What?" He said, "That throw was further than the school record here." So he said,
and that was out the spin.
Yeah, without the space. So you're a discus thrower. He said, "I can teach you a turn." He said, "I'll teach you a turn." He said, "Because, we got our first meet coming up in 2 weeks, but I can teach you a turn." And so over the course of that next 2 months, right into the West Coast Relays, he was teaching me this little simple turn. West Coast Relays came around, and that's when I set a national junior college discus record, and the school record that I also set that same night, stood for 41 years at the institution. But when I first went out, they said, "Oh, you're a runner, you're a quarterman." I said, "No, I'm a discus thrower." Black discus thrower, come on, that's like that was in the same bag as a black swimmer and a black tennis player and so forth at the time.